For many, the history of Colombia, despite stretching back thousands of years, is dominated by knowledge of drug lords like Pablo Escobar and little else. Colombian history, especially since the establishment of the Republic in 1886, has been marked by political violence that has shaken the country to its knees and claimed the lives of countless people. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at the situation in Colombia in the post-war period, an undeclared civil war that pitted left versus right, a decade little known to most, but commonly referred to as la Violencia by those who do. This is the Cold War. It is rare that the institutions of a country break down to such a degree that anarchic violence runs rampant across the state. Yet in 1948, building tensions in Colombia's political system spilled over into the countryside, where a decade-long campaign of brutality took hold. Political partisan conflicts gave way to mob violence, organized crime, and local militias settling personal feuds. Over 200,000 people lost their lives in this bloody stain on 20th century history, and to this day, Colombians rue the decade of la Violencia, a decade that shaped and marked Colombian politics and life to this very day. So, the nation of Colombia by the start of the Cold War was not new to political violence. The state had been ruled for many decades by two opposing political parties, the conservative oligarchists and the liberals, with neither able to hold onto power for very long. An important difference to keep in mind here between Colombian politics and many of the nations around it at the time was that the Colombian populace had always been heavily involved in the political process. As a result, both the ruling parties attempted to instill into their power bases fanatic loyalty, looking to leverage that as both votes on the ballot and bodies on the front line. Going back as far as 1876, political violence was evident as the conservative politicians of the country whipped a religious zeal into the peasantry into a near holy war against the liberal government. This civil war, which lasted 11 months, killed around 20,000 people. As decades followed, violent outbursts came and went, and people only had greater reason to align with their political party, blaming the other side for the problems within the nation. And then Colombia greeted the turn of the century with the Thousand Days War, fought between the Liberal Party and the National Party, and then later the Conservative Party. During the war, it's estimated that well over 100,000 people died. These wars and ongoing violence were certainly tragedies unto themselves, but were only paving the way for something much worse to come. To quote Professor of History Fernando Guillén Martinez at the National University, quote, "The civil wars of the 19th century contributed more than anything else to the dysfunction of peasant life, to the destruction of the social, moral, and economic importance of the smaller urban centers, and to the conversion of the majority of the population into fanatic bands whose only hope of survival consisted in vanquishing the enemy on the national scale, imposing the dominance of one party over the other." Now, throughout their tumultuous relationship, the liberal and conservative political factions would, in times of strife, join together in governments of national unity until the situation either calmed down or until one side became dissatisfied. A potential falling out would then lead to increased partisanship among the populace, and often then end violently. Neither faction was above using mob violence, or the threat of it, to achieve power by any means. And like in most situations like this in history, it was the innocent who found themselves on the end of the political spear. Okay, so with all this established, exactly when the period known specifically as La Violencia started is a contested topic among historians. The first among many contenders was the year 1930, when the Liberals won power through a fair election, succeeding a long-serving conservative government. While the conservative establishment peacefully turned over the institutions of state, the liberal populace committed crimes of property destruction, church burnings, and even murder, targeting landowners and industrial magnates. While the liberal government made a genuine effort to suppress the violent outbursts and arrest those responsible, it did little to save their reputation, and the episode left wounds to fester, wounds which would resurface in later decades. While this period of political violence produced an unknown number of deaths, it was certainly nowhere near the number of people killed that would be seen during the years of La Violencia. Similarly, these outbursts were akin to previous periods of violence committed by both sides of the political spectrum throughout Colombian history. Thus, 1930 isn't commonly considered the genuine beginning of the conflict. That is more commonly bestowed upon the year 1946, when the government once again flipped. The Liberal Party in the 1946 election was divided, near evenly split between their reformist and moderate factions, both of which had each served 2 of the 4 previous administrative terms. Meanwhile, the conservative candidate, Marino Ospina Perez, held a minority of the votes, but still more than each of his 2 opponents. The scars of 1930 and its succeeding years hadn't yet healed, and the conservative populace, emboldened by their political victory, repaid the violence in kind. The government initially tried to suppress the violence, but the actions of Ospina Perez would only end up adding fuel to the fire. The conservatives demanded a reversal to much of the land reform that had been instituted over the last 4 administrations. The liberals, in turn, took to the streets to protest. Amongst partisan violence already ripping the nation apart, the conservative establishment joined the fray in trying to suppress the marches. As months of violence turned to years, the anarchy only spread. Unlike in 1930, there seemed to be no end in sight. It's at this point we should introduce a man by the name of Jorge Eliécer Gaitán. He was the leader of the Liberal Party in 1948 and sought to disrupt the status quo of both parties. His rhetoric drifted away from taxes and land reform and instead took aim right at the heart of the Conservative Party. He denounced the Conservatives' oligarchical structure and framed the Liberal opposition as a movement of the people. This, combined with the rise of third-party movements, which identified with class and worker issues, frightened the Conservative voter base to their core. As fears of political ostracization grew, Juan Roa Sierra, an unemployed man in his mid-20s, assassinated Gaitán on April 9th. There are multiple competing theories surrounding Gaitán's murder, including a Soviet conspiracy to increase Moscow's influence in the region, but these are speculation at best, and the disgruntled loner theory seems most plausible. The events that followed would eventually be described by President Perez as the most dangerous moment in the republic's history. The people, feeling oppressed by the government and suffering from attacks by conservative partisans, watched the man who they thought would win the 1950 election die in the street. A mob quickly formed and chased down Juan Roa Sierra, beating him to death. This began El Bogotazo, the final event which could be characterized as the beginning of La Violencia. El Bogotazo was a 10-hour riot which saw widespread looting and the destruction of much of downtown Bogotá. The mob moved through the streets of the capital, intending to storm the presidential palace, and other mobs soon formed in more rural areas across the country as revolutionary boards claimed authority. The military, which had largely tried to maintain its neutrality to this point, either defected to the protesters or, more often than not, sided with the government. The riots of April 9th saw around 1,500 dead and 20,000 people injured. In the aftermath, the battle lines had been very clearly drawn. The conservative oligarchs, a majority of the military, and a mix of conservatives and moderates lined up on one side, and the workers' movements, revolutionary councils, and unarmed populace lined the other. However, these lines would soon blur as the conflict expanded, and the result? Well, a decade-long undeclared civil war that raged across Colombia. Though mostly classified today as rural conflict, the reality of La Violencia is that it took place across the entire nation. The conservative establishment had taken their turn in power to politicize the police and armed forces, replacing liberal officers and officials with conservative loyalists. This would, however, backfire as liberal partisans would see a wave of disgruntled defectors bolster their ranks and organize them into true guerrilla forces. This situation was amplified by the fact that conservative oligarchs, as well as wealthy liberals, had kept their focus on urban areas in the years leading up to the conflict. This left a disgruntled and armed population already operating in relative autonomy for years. In their attempts to consolidate power, the government had only worsened their own situation. When examining a traditional civil war, it's common to note battle lines on a map. Who were the two sides, what territory did they control, and who were the notable leaders? The depressing realization of the early years of La Violencia, however, is that the conflict was anything but typical. Guerrillas operated as marauding bands, combating the Colombian military and conservative militias in both urban and rural environments. Massacres were often committed by both sides, and militias, in need of funds, commonly resorted to extortion and theft. As the political divide widened through the rest of 1948, recruitment for paramilitaries skyrocketed, and the death toll shot up with it. Though exact figures are impossible to know, a reasonable current historical estimate puts the figure at around 43,000 deaths in the first year of the conflict alone. The election of 1950, which was actually held in November 1949, only brought more controversy to the conflict. The Liberal Party withdrew from the contest, calling for a boycott after a failed assassination attempt on their candidate, Dario Echeandia. This led to the Conservative Party candidate, Laureano Gomez, receiving all but 23 of the 1.1 million ballots cast. But his authority was ineffectual at best, compounded by an ongoing illness which left him unable to fill his presidential duties. This left governance in the hands of an underling, Roberto Urdaneta Arbeláez, until 1953. The violence during this period was the most brutal of the entire conflict. La Violencia had devolved into a state-sanctioned campaign of violence which left no one safe. At the macro level, communist and liberal paramilitaries clashed with the armed forces and conservative irregulars. This bloodshed then flowed down to the micro level of authority. Local and regional governments employed civilians as militias, sometimes to try and police the violence, but more commonly to enact their own terror. Governors settled personal scores, and regional authorities battled each other over resources and land claims. This terrifying anarchy carried on for half a decade, and it was more than obvious to members of both leading parties that the current establishment wasn't working. This led to members from many sides of the political spectrum to secretly support a bid by Army Commander Gustavo Rojas Pinilla to take over the government. The military coup was successfully carried out in 1953, and now dictator Rojas Pinilla immediately sought to put an end to the violence. Many of the militias, conservative, liberal, or non-aligned, were still fighting due to the fear that if they laid down their weapons, they would be prosecuted and potentially executed for their crimes. For this reason, when Rojas Pinilla offered amnesty to any guerrilla who surrendered, an unknown number of thousands did so without hesitation. In a single stroke, the worst of the brutality was over, but La Violencia still persisted. While he was in office, Rojas Pinilla enjoyed support from all sides of the political spectrum, and in turn, their partisan forces. While not necessarily ending the conflict, having most of the armed populace supporting the government was good enough for 1954. This did, however, exclude the most radical groups of political militias from both the left and the right sides of the spectrum. Throughout 1954 and 1955, paramilitaries from Gomez's wing of the Conservative Party and the Colombian Communist Party would continually clash with government-aligned forces throughout the country. By now, however, the scale of the conflict had dramatically shrunk, with a vast majority of the violence taking place in the densely populated central departments of the nation, including Caldas, Valle, Antioquia, Cundinamarca, Tolima, Huila, and Carca. The rebels, largely fixed in specific pockets of territory, went about establishing their own governments, which they ran like mafias or even just as local authorities. The more left-leaning groups tended to attempt small-scale sovereign republics, while other groups stuck to more traditional methods of partnering with corrupt local officials. Many of these gangsters, both urban and rural, were known as parajos and typically fell into a more conservative camp. They assured the compliance of the population through threat of assassination, which they were not afraid to follow through on, and used their positions of power to extort millions in seized crops, stolen goods, and whatever else they could get their hands on. From both the parajos and the Soviet experiments, Colombia saw a sizable drop in its portion of coffee, sugar, and cacao production. In 1957, Colombia returned to civilian rule with the establishment of the National Front. This partnership between the liberal and conservative parties saw a 16-year agreement in which they would alternate between which party held executive power each term and evenly distributed the rest of the government positions between the two parties. As government authority was gradually re-established, the remaining rebels found themselves increasingly isolated and with shrinking bases of support. Eventually, all but some communist and other remaining paramilitary groups laid down their arms. 1958 marked the transition away from the Civil War and the generally acknowledged end to la violencia, but not to the end of the bloodshed entirely. To this day, the entire conflict is shrouded in a veil of uncertainty. Many accounts and analyses exist which blame either the left or the right for the violence. Those that favor the conservative government blame the liberal insurgents for la violencia by placing them as the initial spark to the conflict, and everything that came after as just retribution to justify their actions. Those that favor the Liberal Party blame perceived injustices on the Colombian people for the outbreak of violence. Police brutality, workers being terrorized by private gangs, and silencing of left-wing political voices are all stated as reasons for the outbreak of violence. However, neither narrative tells the full story. La Violencia was the culmination of nearly 100 years of the two major political forces in Colombia using their influence to wage unspeakable violence against their opposition. Although classified as a civil war, the conflict beginning in 1948 was more of a collapse into total anarchy. The inability of the state to quell the unrest in the populace leading up to the conflict is a reflection of both sides treating political power with more importance than the lives of their citizens, and the horrors that followed were the results of that neglect. As in most cases of civil violence, casualty numbers are hard to come by. The difficulty in estimating the numbers of deaths is compounded by the fact that local authorities during the conflict were more concerned with arming their own militias than counting the dead. The lowest estimates of the death toll put the number at around 180,000 dead, but given the scale and longevity of the conflict, the estimates of 200,000 or even as high as 300,000 are certainly plausible. The unfortunate conclusion to this chapter of Colombian history is that while it may have brought an end to the Civil War, it gave birth to the ongoing Colombian conflict. The National Front worked well to limit the violence when it was created, but it arguably prolonged the bloodshed by purposefully excluding all far-left and far-right groups from state institutions. The early 1960s saw the remaining communist guerrillas unite into the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, a rebel group which carried on fighting until it was finally demobilized in 2017. While the FARC is the most well-known opposition in Colombia in recent years, the conflict in the country has seen asymmetric warfare from both right and left-wing rebel groups, as well as organized criminal syndicates, all fighting for influence in the country. To this extent, some argue that la violencia never truly ended, given the visual scars still present in the nation generations after. There is no one way to view this heartbreaking portion of Colombia's history, and while many interpretations will tend to focus on the people involved, the political ideologies, and the social partisanship, the most important subject matter when remembering this conflict is the victims. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you have liked and subscribed to the channel and have pressed the bell button so it is not shot down in the street, sparking a 10-hour riot that eventually causes a 10-year civil war between various YouTube channels. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.